It was one of the most thrilling wins in recent Jets history. Today we are reliving the 2015 victory by the Jets over the New England Patriots ahead on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, June 8th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to this show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL, and when you enter promo code LockedOnNFL, they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Well, it is the off-season. It's kind of the quiet part of the NFL calendar. One of the things I like to do at this time of year is relive some great Jets victories. So on today's show, we're going to go back to 2015. We're going to break down what happened in a huge Jets victory that year over the New England Patriots. My buddy Michael Nania of JetsXFactor.com joins me for this episode. It was the last time the Jets were good, 2015, and today here we are going to review probably the best game that team played that season. It was the second to last game of the year. It was Week 16. It was a great victory in overtime over the rival Patriots. And joining me today to talk about the Jets' best victory of 2015 is my good friend Michael Nani of JetsXFactor.com. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, John.
Now, this 2015 Jets team, in all the years I've been watching them, I think they're one of the most underrated Jets rosters, one of the most underrated Jets seasons. I think part of it's because the week after the game we're talking about, they lost a game in Buffalo to miss the playoffs. So I think a lot of people left that season with a negative feeling, but I had a lot of fun that year. And when I look back on it, I remembered like this New England game. I think this is one of the, I think the 2004 Jets team is probably the team that's the most underrated in all the years I've been watching them. The 2015 team, though, is up there because, I mean, they had offensive firepower. They had a good young defensive line. This team, it was a really good roster.
Yeah, I mean, I remember prior to that Buffalo game, which obviously we know what went down in Buffalo, but I was thinking if they could get in, they could be a real threat because of, it's one of the most balanced Jets teams, I think, of, the 21st century, because like you said, they had such a good defensive line. The secondary was, even if it wasn't quite to that, prime Revis, early Rex Ryan days type of level, it was still playing well. They were taking the ball away a lot. And then offensively, and it turned out to be a one-year wonder, but at least for that 1 year, the way that Fitzpatrick was clicking with Marshall and Decker was really special. And then on top of that, they had a very good run game with Chris Ivory. So it was a really good all-around team. And I was curious to see what they could do if they could sneak into the playoffs.
Yeah, and, it was like, it's funny because I was looking back on this, and as I watched this game over, I thought, at that point in time, I was pretty confident in Todd Bowles, which kind of feels crazy to say now because Bowles obviously isn't much of a head coach, but that first year with Mike Maccagnan and Bowles, it kind of felt like maybe they were putting something together because they had that big year out of Brandon Marshall, the big year out of Eric Decker. But also, we're going to get to this, they had some draft picks who looked pretty good. It was Leonard Williams' rookie year. Lorenzo Malden, actually, it's easy to forget because he did nothing after his rookie year, but 2015, Lorenzo Malden actually showed some flashes. He might be a player for this team. And it all kind of fell apart the next year when, all the guys they signed got old and the draft picks never really hit. But there was like a little stretch there, that 1 year stretch where it really felt like the Jets were moving. And they could be building something special.
I specifically remember after they lost that Buffalo game, just, there were a lot of negative emotions after that and it hurt in the moment. But once that kind of settled down, I remember reflecting and I would tell myself, yeah, this hurts, but at the very least, you could look forward and the Jets have people you could trust at the top. That's what I remember telling myself with Todd Bowles, with Mike Maccagnan. It felt like they were moving in the right direction and that regardless of how that season finished. And, there were still holes on the roster, I think, looking long term, because it was a veteran team for the most part. Despite those questions, I think you looked at the way Bowles came in and stabilized the culture of a team that, let's face it, in the last couple of years with Rex Ryan, there was a lot of drama, a lot of disappointment. It just felt like a mess. And then Bowles comes in and he just brings this stability and this even keeled mentality that really felt like it was going to stick and work for the long run. And then McCagnon, I mean, he was the executive of the year, which is it's so wild in hindsight now, knowing how bad he turned out to be. But, he made so many moves that hit in this particular offseason,
Like
specifically with the veteran moves. So I remember being confident in those two guys after this year.
95% of Jets fans love McCagnon after the first year. I love McCagnon
Yeah.
after the first year. It's crazy. But in this game, I went back and watched this game. And it's funny because this was an overtime victory. But even though it was an overtime, it really felt to me like the Jets were the much better team. And New England had a lot of breaks just to get the game to overtime. The Jets, in many ways, dominated this football game. In fact, I can give you the yardage. The Jets outgained New England by a wide margin in this one. The Jets had 428 yards. New England had 284. So this was even though it's crazy to say an overtime game was a dominant performance, but this was a dominant performance by the Jets.
Yeah, like I remember in hindsight, like we remember it as an overtime game, but when you were watching that, it felt like the Jets were totally in control there. And like you mentioned the final stats, they were overwhelmingly on the Jets side. But yeah, I think it was indicative of where this team was at that point of the season, because they started hot, they had that rough stretch in the middle of the season, they were 5-5, and then they went on that win streak, and this was the peak of that win streak, and felt like everything was going their way. And look, at this point of the Patriots dynasty, and it was on the latter end, but they still had two more championships after this, so they were still at their peak. You had to be perfect just to beat them by one score at this point of Tom Brady and Belichick's run together. So that's just how it was when you played the Patriots. You weren't going to blow them out, but even when you played your best, it would be a close win. But as we know now, beating the Patriots as the New York Jets is not something that comes around too often. So it felt like a sharper performance than overtime would indicate, but just being the Pats made it a special performance.
And I also had this memory of the Jets blowing a big lead, which I kind of did because they were up 17-3, but it was like 3-3 late in the second quarter. Even so, and I and Eagle and Dan Fouts called this game on CBS. They were talking about it, and they mentioned, I remember it was early in the second quarter, they said, it feels like the Jets are really in control of this game. And they finally started to take control. They scored a couple of touchdowns, one late in the second quarter. It was a goal line pass to Brandon Marshall, and then early in the third quarter, Ryan Fitzpatrick hit a 33-yard pass into double coverage, and Marshall came down with it. So the Jets were up 17-6. And that was one of the notes I made about this game. And I remembered this. Brandon Marshall, even though he was a Jet for 2 years, he was only great for one of my favorite Jets players of all time. And there's a guy I compare him to, the guy who played on the defensive side of the ball, Chris Jenkins, who was a defensive tackle who had like one dominant year in 2008. That Marshall year in 2015, if Jenkins had one dominant year on the defensive side of the ball, Marshall had one dominant year on the offensive side of the ball. It was just but it was the most dominant year I've ever seen a Jets player have. And one of the notes I made about this game is that you could see, like, even watching the game footage, it wasn't the all 22 film, but New England made a conscious effort. And you saw it on big passing downs that on any time the Jets had to throw the ball, they were double teaming Marshall and they were double teaming Eric Decker. And they did a pretty good job of taking Decker out of the game, except for the winning touchdown, which we'll get to later. Marshall, they were doubling. It still didn't matter. Fitzpatrick was looking for him, and they were completing passes, and Marshall was still getting open.
Yeah, and that was really the story of the season for Marshall. I feel like because it wasn't like amazing scheming or anything like that was racking up production for him. He was just, as you said, dominant, and that's a word we throw around a lot when a guy has great production and he plays great. But I think in terms of matching the literal meaning of that word, like being physically overpowering to other people, I think Brandon Marshall encapsulated that in this season more than definitely any other Jets player that I've watched. And, as far as any of my sports teams that I'm a fan of, match that to a T, because really that was the gist of his whole season. I mean, the goal line fades. He conditioned me. I was 14, 15 years old at the time of the season. He conditioned me to think that was a regular play, that, why don't you always run goal line fades? in the end zone in football, but obviously it's not. He just made it look so easy that season. But like the passes over the middle when they were contested, he would always come down with. So he was just physically overwhelming, and obviously it turned out to be an outlier. Came back down to earth the next season, and he was 31 years old at that point. The prior season with the Bears was a down year. Something clicked for him that year. Um, it was whether it was the chemistry with Fitzpatrick or just I know he loved playing in New York. Maybe it's just the energy of that. But whatever it was, like I've not seen a season like that from a Jets player on either side of the ball since I started watching, and I started watching in 2011, so I did miss those peak Revis years, 2009, 2010. But yeah, it was something special to watch, and this game was the pinnacle of it.
Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Birddogs. There's nothing like a great Jets win over the arch rival New England Patriots. Jets had plenty of players that year who made them look good, like Brandon Marshall. Well, Birddogs makes you look good. Birddogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddogs shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts that are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fixed this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that makes you look like khaki, but stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. I'm sure the stars of the 2015 Jets like Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Darrelle Revis, I'm sure they'd all love Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code LockedOnNFL. It's all one word with no space for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. Again, that's birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL. Promo code LockedOnNFL for a freestyle Yeti tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off. We promise you. Now, we criticize offensive coordinators a lot on this podcast, and offensive coordinators get criticized a lot in this fan base. So I mentioned the Jets jumped out to a 17-3 lead. It was early in the third quarter. One other thing that I noticed that I thought Chan Gailey did that was really smart is you saw a lot of sets in this game with two running backs. And what he was doing a lot, it was Bilal Powell and Chris Ivory. And then Ivory had to leave the game for a stretch because he was banged up a little bit. So Stephen Ridley came in. And what he was doing is he was lining these two backs up, and then he was putting one in motion. And I thought that was a really smart move. I actually remember writing about this after the game because when you motion a running back out of the backfield, it kind of forces the defense to give away its coverage. Because if a linebacker follows that back out of the backfield, it's a dead giveaway that it's man-to-man. If nobody follows the back out of the backfield, it's a giveaway, it's a zone. But the fact you have two guys out there, if you motion one out there, there's still one back out there to leave the threat of the run on the table. And I thought that was something in this game the Jets exploited to great effect.
Yeah, and then at the end of the season, Powell was really coming on, especially in the passing game. So that was one of the late developments that I thought helped them kind of turn the season around after they had that midseason kind of lapse there. But even going back to this recent Jet season in 2022, I felt like in the beginning of the year, prior to Breece Hall's injury, that's something the Jets were doing a good job of. Those two back packages. You look at the bomb that Breece Hall had against the Dolphins in week 5, that was off of a 2-back set, and they faked it. I believe they faked it to Carter, and Hall ran the wheel route off of that. And like you said, it just gives defenses multiple things to think about, and you could tip off coverage but still keep the threat of the run. So I'm a fan of 2-back sets, and at the end of this 2015 season, Powell and his impact in the receiving game definitely benefited from some of that.
And another thing the Jets did great in this game, the offensive line came to play in this one. It's kind of refreshing to think about a Jets offensive line that was controlling the point of attack. The Jets ended up running for 143 yards in this game. And as they built this lead, it was, Ivory had a good game. Powell had a good game. You're talking about Bilal Powell. To me, like, that's one of those things, like if somebody tells me starts about Bilal Powell, I know you're a diehard Jets fan because he's one of those guys who kind of like flies under the radar. So but like the people who are like the real Jets fans, they know how good Bilal Powell was. So I was glad to see him produce in this game. And Stephen Ridley, who I remember like doing nothing for the Jets, actually broke a few good runs in this game. So they were able to control the line of scrimmage. And that's another thing I think helped them build up this early 17-3 lead heading in, early in the third quarter.
Yeah, and I actually just pulled Powell's game log from that season back up, and I forgot about this, but he missed 5 games that year. and the Jets went 1-4 in those games. They were 9-2 when he played.
And
He missed
he missed the Week 17 game against Buffalo.
Yeah, one
They
of those
lost.
was that Week 17 game, and then he had 4 in a row in the midseason stretch. The only one of those they won was that Jacksonville game. So he was an important player for them, and his receiving down the stretch over those last 6 games that he played, he had 299 receiving yards in 6 games. So he was, at what is that? About 50, not 50. Yeah, about 50 yards a game. He had 91 against the Giants, 46 Titans, 54 Cowboys, and then 34 in this game. So, I mean, he was a big contributor. And a big part of this Jets offense, or a little quirk that I guess that they had this year, is outside their top 2 receivers, because they were so dominant, they really had nobody else who was consistently contributing to that receiving game. So it left room for the running backs to get involved in the passing game because they didn't really have a third receiver who's consistent. There's non-existent tight end production. So it kind of left room for the running backs to get involved. And Ivory took advantage at times, but down the stretch, Bilal Powell really slipped into that role.
I remember at the time I said that Bilal Powell was essentially the number 3 receiver at that point, especially late in the season. So the Jets were up 17-3, and then this game turned. It was a bad error, and it's funny because there are things about this game I remember. There are things I don't. So heading into this one, I remember that the Jets had jumped out to a big lead, and my thought was, okay, well, you're playing Brady, you're playing New England. Of course, they're going to come back, but the big play that turned the game around was actually not on the offense for New England. It was on defense where Jabal Sheard sacked Ryan Fitzpatrick on I think it was a third down play, and Jamie Collins returned the fumble for a touchdown to get it to 17-13. So that's really what turned. So it's funny, I misremembered it. The Jets really should have been running away with that game, and Fitzpatrick made a big mistake that kind of put New England back in it.
Yeah, I also forgot about that play before I looked back into it. But I mean, those plays change the entire course of the game because as simple as taking out that play, the Jets would, they were up 17-6 at that time. They had another field goal to start the fourth quarter. Just like that, you take out the fumble touchdown and it's 20-6, and it's a completely different narrative about the game. And even with Brady having his drive at the end, which he always does, the Jets had 2 scores of cushion without that fumble return. So that's a Patriots signature, though. They've always had a knack for forcing turnovers and converting them into touchdowns. And they're the biggest game-changing plays that you can have because it not only erases the drive that you just had on offense, but, it's a free score without having to drive the ball down the field and take all the time and plays that is supposed to require. So that's what the Patriots do. But I forgot about that play. That is really the only reason the Jets didn't blow this one out.
Yeah, and then we got to the fourth quarter. The Jets had a field goal, so it's 20-13. And one other note I had, I talked about the offensive line, how dominant they were a little bit earlier. The defensive line played great in this game as well. And this was a really talented young Jets defensive line. They had, the Snacks Harrison's in the middle at nose tackle. You've got, and this is a guy you forget about how good he was because the end of his Jets career ended so badly. But Muhammad Wilkerson, his first 5 years, was a great player. He was a star, and this was probably his best season. Sheldon Richardson was there. Leonard Williams was a rookie. And I think there are 2 things I got to give the defensive line credit for. In the first 3 quarters, they completely made New England one-dimensional. I mean, New England couldn't get anything going on the ground. Jets completely, and that was a great Jets run defense. But then the fourth quarter came along, and the Jets are still nursing this lead. And I mean, every time Brady's dropping back, he's got a guy in his face, whether it's Richardson, whether it's Wilkerson. And Lorenzo Mauldin, again, you forget that Lorenzo Mauldin had a kind of promising rookie season. He had a sack in this game. He had a couple of hits. And he was active in the fourth quarter. So the Jets defensive line really came to play as they're trying to close out this game. They do give up a touchdown. We'll get to that in a bit, but Jets defensive line was great in the fourth quarter of this game.
Oh yeah, I mean the defensive line really was, I think, because you think about this team, the first thing you think of is always going to be Fitzpatrick and Marshall and Decker, but the real anchor of the team was that defensive line, both the pressure and the run defense. And in this game, they were great against a Patriots team that was still elite offensively at that time. I mean, they started that season 10-0. It was a great season. They ended up losing the conference championship, obviously, but they were still at their peak there. And this game, I mean, Wilkerson got hurt in that last game, but like you said, he was a star at this point. I mean, the way we look at Quinn Williams right now, his standing in the hierarchy, I think Wilkerson was similar at this point. And, you had Leonard Williams next to him, who had a great rookie season. Snacks Harrison was there, Sheldon Richardson, the Sons of Anarchy, as they were called at the time. So it was a fantastic defensive line, especially against the run. I remember the run defense this year, except for, maybe a game here or there, is just automatic stuffs time after time. They would not give up an inch in the run game. So I think that was the true anchor of the team.
Now, New England drives down the field for a touchdown late in the fourth quarter. Now, this is one I can't get on the Jets for because it's Brady. It's the fourth quarter. Brady always does this. The Patriots go down the field and they score with a little under 2 minutes left. There was one thing that I would criticize the Jets for in that situation. It's really a coaching thing. New England faced 2 fourth downs in that series. Both times there was a completion to Rob Gronkowski. Both times he was covered in single coverage. Once it was by Calvin Pryor. Once it was by Marcus Williams, who was the number 4 corner on the team. That's where Brady's going at that point of the game. It's fourth down. That's a spot where I wonder why they didn't stick Revis or even Cromartie. Even Cromartie had a bad year, but I felt like that's the one spot where I might criticize the Jets a little bit because the game was on the line there. They're putting the ball in Brady's hands. He's going to Gronk, and the Jets put guys who are, not their best cover guys on him. And Revis, another guy we forget, he was so bad the next year and the contract ended up being a disaster. In 2015, Revis was still like 90 to 95% of peak Revis. So for me, like that's the only area where I get on the Jets that last drive where New England tied it up. I think that they made some bad defensive calls, but outside of that, I mean, it's Brady being Brady. The Jets did a good job bottling New England up for the most part that game, but he's going to get a touchdown on that last drive.
I mean, at that point, this is the first offensive touchdown they scored of the game. So it's really, even with that, you're very happy with the defensive effort. You just look back to that fumble return and how much of an impact that has. But yeah, it really felt like, and this was true throughout the entirety of Gronk's career with the Patriots. It just felt like even when you knew the Pats were going to go to him, the Jets didn't have an answer, except, Jamal Adams had those 1 or 2 games where he just lit it up in coverage, which I guess turned out to be an outlier now that he's in Seattle. That hasn't really held up. But other than that, it really felt like that Gronk could do what he wanted against the Jets. But in this game, I mean, besides that last drive, they did do a mostly good job with him, I believe. He only had 4 catches, and 2 of them were those conversions on that last drive. So for the most part, a good job. But yeah, you mentioned a couple of players in the secondary. I think Revis this season was, not the peak Revis, but he had plenty of takeaways, and I think he was solid for the most part in
He had an
coverage.
interception. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but he had an interception.
Yeah, interception in this game. So it was mostly a good season, and it would have been worth putting him on Gronk in that situation.
Now, here's another sequence I forgot about is the Jets actually got the ball back with a little over 2 minutes left in the game, and Eric Decker's been silent for the whole game, but he draws a penalty on a third down play to extend the drive. And late in the drive, Fitzpatrick has Quincy Enunwa open deep, and I don't think it was a great throw. I think he overthrew him a little bit, but Enunwa reacted like he should have caught it. Enunwa was upset with himself. And I had forgotten about this because Quincy Enunwa ends up being one of the heroes in overtime. But if the Jets had lost that game, Enunwa probably would have been one of the GOATs because he had a chance to essentially end the game with a catch. Jets probably would have been in field goal range. Randy Bullock probably hits a game-winning field goal, and they missed that opportunity at the end of regulation.
Yeah, I remember that being frustrated. And, it's one of those close calls where it's like, should he have caught it? Could he have caught it? I think you can definitely say he could have, but it also was a little deep. So it was a tough one there. One of those close misses on a golden opportunity down the field. But as you said, he would make up for it in overtime, which we'll get to. But in that moment, that was a tough one.
Now, we have to start overtime with the coin toss because this is one of the most baffling coaching decisions I've ever made. And for once, it's not a Jets coach making it. In fact, there were actually 2 really baffling coaching decisions I thought Bill Belichick made. Right before the end of the first half, the Patriots had the ball. They had time to do something, and they essentially just sat on it and ran the clock out. And they were down 10-3. They did not play well. I mean, I as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, okay, they haven't played that well in the first half. Maybe they just want to get to the locker room. But yeah, Brady. So all I could think about was if Todd Bowles or Robert Saleh or Adam Gase ever did something like this, we'd never hear the end of it. But they didn't attack at the end of the first half. But the one that really, I still to this day, I don't think has ever been explained. The Patriots win the overtime coin toss and don't take the ball. But it's actually worse because I think it was Matthew Slater whoever called it for New England made a huge mistake. The Patriots win the coin toss, and he says kick. Now, after you win the coin toss, you have options. You can kick, receive, or you can take a certain side of the field. I think what he wanted to do was, I think he wanted to take the wind, but because he said kick, that was the Patriots' choice. If he had chosen like we want to defend this side of the field, the Patriots would have gotten the wind. He said kick, so the Patriots' choice was kick, so the Jets essentially got to take the wind as well. So it was two mistakes. The bigger one, I think, was Belichick for whatever reason not taking the ball, and that ended up being costly. But the Patriots made another mistake because the guy who called it said we want to kick, so it cost them the win, which I guess was not decisive. But really, I can't believe I'm saying a disastrous coin toss, but a disastrous coin toss for New England in overtime.
That was so bizarre. I just remember being so confused in that moment, like being frustrated at first that they lost, but then not really knowing what's going on. Then ultimately seeing that the Jets were going to get it, and I was like, okay, we'll take it. I mean, do you remember? Did Belichick give a reason as to? I do remember he, told the media after the game that he did intend to kick the ball off. That there was no confusion. It was just the communication between Slater and the ref, but they did want to kick it off. Do you remember if he explained exactly why they did
I
that?
looked up. I tried because I thought the same thought. I tried to look it up. I could never find an explanation for it. It was the only other comparable situation I think was when Marty Mornhinweg was the coach of the Lions. They were playing against the Bears. I think it was actually a year the Bears were playing at the University of Illinois because Soldier Field was being remodeled. There was an overtime. This was back when it was just pure sudden death, where a field goal on the first drive wins it. And I remember he took the wins, so that was like the only other time I remember that happening. But there was at least it was a bad reason. There was at least a reason. I still can't figure out what Belichick was doing in that situation. It was really weird. And it ended up being costly because the Jets went down the field and scored a touchdown. And I'm going to go back to give Chan Gailey credit. And this is something I missed the first time I watched it, is the Jets actually hit this pass to Quincy and Nunwa. It was a quick little out pass, and the Patriots kind of like got confused in their coverage in the third quarter. And Nunwa took it down the sideline for 21 yards. And I think for me, like a good offensive coordinator, what he does is when he sees something works, he takes a note of it and he goes back to it at the perfect time. And that's what Gailey did again. In overtime, he went back to the exact same play that gained them 21 yards, and the Patriots busted the coverage again, and the Jets ran an effective rubber out, but Enunwa takes the ball down the left sideline and puts the Jets in scoring position. It was, the play everybody, I think that's the play everybody remembers from that game, was the Enunwa catch and run in overtime, making amends for the, maybe not a drop, but for the play he could have made right before the end of regulation.
Yeah, and just going back to that coin toss, it's interesting because like I would get it if it was a low scoring,
Yeah.
low scoring kind of game, bad weather, whatever. But the Jets had put up 420 yards, or not that much at that point, but still they were having a great offensive day for the most part. And it didn't seem like it was, the type of game where you felt so confident in your defense that you would be confident you would stop the team, get the ball back for a field goal. And then as we saw at this drive, I mean, you mentioned that's a great point in terms of setting up that play with the Nunwa. That just plays into why it was a puzzling decision to kick, because the Jets did have things going to set them up going to this overtime. I remember feeling pretty good once they got it that something good was going to happen. Maybe it's hindsight for me to say that because they won, but and because they blew the lead by that point. But I do kind of remember getting the ball and feeling confident, but that's just how that offense was that year, because it was a good offense and it felt like they made plays when they needed to, especially in this winning streak down the stretch. I mean, you look at the Giants game, the Cowboys game, they were starting to make plays when they needed to. And then Enunwa came up big here in a big spot, and Chan Gailey, like you said, with a very well timed call after hitting the same one earlier.
All I could think about after that coin toss is if Adam Gase ever did that, we'd have an immediate episode. We have the regular episode. We have a bonus episode to break down this coin toss decision. But anyway, after the Enunwa catch and run, again they hit a pass in the double coverage to Marshall. I mean, that's just Marshall just unstoppable this year. And then the game ends on a touchdown pass. Eric Decker, they've bottled up all game because they've been doubling him and Marshall, and they still can't stop Marshall. They were able to stop Decker, but Fitzpatrick just throws a perfect touch pass to the corner of the end zone for Decker, and the Jets score a touchdown and win this game.
Yeah, I mean, and this play, really, this drive, or at least the end of it, I think kind of sums up one of the best parts of this offense. That was the red zone. That was where this offense really shined throughout the year, because there were times when, the passing game would stall a little bit, but you could always count on the red zone touchdown, and it was because of these two guys and the chemistry they had with Fitzpatrick. And with Marshall, it was kind of more the box out fade, getting in front of a guy and just using his size. With Decker, I think it was more the route running and the timing and the precision. Obviously, with this one into the back of the end zone, but he had a couple slants over the course of the year. That was really his big bread and butter. So the red zone offense, I just pulled it up right now. They were third best in terms of touchdowns, 66%. And then defensively, they were even better. They were number one at 35%. So that's where I think the Jets were so dominant this year, is they finished drives with touchdowns, and they did not give up touchdowns when they got backed up. So the clutch football, and you throw in the takeaways too. They took the ball away a lot, and they did have some turnovers this year, but it wasn't terrible. So it was that situational football this year that was really impressive. The red zone, the turnovers, and those are two things they have not really been very good at since then. But hopefully that could turn around this year.
Now the legacy of this game. Now everybody remembers the next week they went to Buffalo and lost and missed the playoffs, and then they were bad the next year. But I think something that gets lost from this game is this actually was a pretty pivotal game in the overall 2015 NFL season, because the Patriots were on the verge of clinching the number one seed in the AFC, and this loss ended up playing a role in them not getting the one seed. They ended up going to Miami the next week and losing again. So the 2-game losing streak pushes them to the number 2 seed, which ended up forcing them to go out to Denver for the AFC Championship game, a game that they lost that they may have won if it was in Foxborough. So even though the Jets did not win, I think you could make a strong case that they contributed a lot to New England not winning the Super Bowl in 2015 by getting this victory.
Yeah, and Denver won those last two games as well. I think it was 2-game edge the Patriots had going into that game. So it was a pivotal game in that AFC playoff picture. And I still wish the Jets had got in and had a chance to make some noise, because it felt like it was wide open that year. Because you come off that game, the Jets have shown they could beat the Patriots, and they're going to have to play them in Foxborough in the playoffs. But even that first game in Foxborough was a competitive game that came down to the fourth quarter. And then the top of the AFC just wasn't, and Denver had an awesome season. They won the Super Bowl, but their defense was amazing, but offensively, Peyton Manning was broken down. Brock Osweiler was replacing him at points of that season. You felt like the Jets could have a dark horse chance. If there was a year where the Jets could make that type of run, it felt like that was it. Obviously, it wasn't meant to be, but at the very least, as you said, this game prevented the Patriots very likely from, I think, at least getting to the Super Bowl.
That's one of my favorite Jets games ever, so I'm glad we talked about it. Michael, thank you for joining me. Look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I hope you had as much fun breaking down this great win as I did. We may do some more classic Jets games over the course of the summer, but that's all for today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Things help us out, help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with a special episode on this Friday.